Welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Lucy Rivera. Today we're going to talk about privacy, data privacy. And to discuss data privacy more in depth, we have attorney Shawn Hoyt, who runs the operations at Cogito.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
Welcome to Discovering the Law, Shawn. Shawn, let's talk about data privacy, what that is, and what kind of data is there, and why do we need it to keep private?
Sure. So data privacy is, a very hot topic these days. So let's unpack those two words. First, data. So what data are we talking about? So data privacy is focused on personal data. So this is data that is capable of being used to identify an individual. So obviously there's things like your name, your email address, your date of birth that can identify you. But there's a lot of other information that can identify a person when it's used in concert with things like that. So your location. For example, if I can match your location with who you are, then that location becomes personal data. If I can match the IP address on your computer with a name, then I know that that's an individual person. Racial identity. There's a whole host of data that can become personal if it's linked with a name or other identifying characteristics. So personal data ends up being construed quite broadly as any information that either identifies you directly or when combined with another piece of information. Now that means the minute you anonymize it, so you remove the ability to trace it back to a person, it's no longer covered. So for example, if I had a list of location data coupled with the people who were at that location on a certain date, but then I deleted the names, now all I have is a list of locations, it's no longer considered personal data because it can't be traced back to a person.
This is really fascinating, interesting information. So how is this data used? In other words, what laws?
So let's quickly say, what does it mean to keep that data private? So data privacy is focused on four main things. One is limiting the amount of data that gets collected. Basically, collect only what you really need, not more than that. The second is how do you use the data, and restricting the ways you can use it to what is really essential to provide whatever service you're trying to provide. A third focus of these laws is security. So what are the institutions or people who collect the data, what do they need to do to keep it secure? And then finally, it's empowering the people whose data is being collected, giving them rights. And we'll talk about that later, where they can have rights with respect to their data. So those are kind of the four main aspects of those laws.
Interesting. So what types of problems were there happening that you're saying gave rise to the rights, to giving rise to these people?
Yeah.
For their...
So one of the main things that led to an outcry for data privacy laws was the onset of what we call big data. And these are companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon that collect massive amounts of data about you in your everyday life. And people started to realize that these companies have, huge, extensive profiles about you. There's also companies that specialize in these profiles that actually pay money to go collect data about you from different sources. And so people began to realize that these companies had tremendous power by having tremendous amount of data. And then once they have that information, bad things can happen. So for example, they can sell that data to third parties who can then market things to you that you didn't consent to. Or people can hack in and get access to that data, steal credit card numbers, and then steal your identity. So there were a number of high-profile cases involving Target, TJ Maxx, a bunch of other companies where there was Experian, who's a credit bureau, where there were these massive data breaches, which then led to millions of people having their data exposed to potential criminals. And the fear of identity theft, coupled with the fear of these corporations having your data and doing things about it that you weren't consenting to, that led to an outcry for legislation that would protect people.
What are the laws in response to these breaches and in the response to these violations? What are the laws, or were there any laws enacted to
Yeah.
protect the data?
So at first, there were no kind of comprehensive laws passed at any national level. Where it started was industries started to police themselves. It started in healthcare with a law called HIPAA, if you've ever heard that. Acronym stands for the Healthcare Information Portability and Accountability Act. And when you go to show up for any medical appointment, you're probably used to signing forms that say, hey, consent to us collecting data from you and telling you how we're going to use that data and what protections you have. So most of us in our day-to-day lives are familiar with HIPAA, even if we don't know the acronym. So that was one of the first ones. And then on the federal, on the banking area, the banking regulators adopted a law called Graham-Leach-Bliley, which, among other things, forces banks to have security protections and limitations on what they do with banking data. And then on another front, when it comes to credit card information, an industry group got together and it passed a set of standards called the Payment Card Industry Standards, PCI, which, for example, that's why when you get any kind of a receipt, they can't list your entire credit card number. They have to hash it and only can list certain numbers. And no one is allowed to store your CVV number, the 3 numbers on the back of your card, because that's prohibited under the PCI standards. Then what happened is some countries felt like that wasn't enough. You couldn't rely on industry to police itself. So they passed national legislation, and it started in Europe. There was a groundbreaking law passed called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which governed all the EU countries. And that really set the ball in motion for more legislation. In the US, the federal government wasn't acting on it yet, so some of the states have stepped up to pass their own laws. It started with California. They passed a law called the California Consumer Privacy Act. And then more recently, you've had Virginia and now Colorado pass their own individual laws. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of laws pending with other states. But we don't yet have any federal legislation, other than like HIPAA and Graham-Leach-Bliley, that would protect data regardless of industry.
Shawn, that's really interesting. Why hasn't there been a federal unification rather than every single state coming up with their own data privacy laws?
Yeah, I think it's largely a question of political priority, is my opinion. If you look at the political discourse over the last several elections, the types of issues that the candidates are talking about, you don't hear data privacy kind of rising to the level of what the major political parties are prioritizing right now. It might be important to some states and to some people, but it doesn't seem to have risen to a level where candidates feel like they need to address it as part of a national political platform. I think that will change. And in part, having all the states have their own laws creates this problem where if you're a national business and you're trying to do business across states, all of a sudden you need to do business differently, state by state. So in California, you might have to have a certain banner on your website, but then in Colorado, it might need to say something different. So how do you go about as a business, having a national business when the laws are different in every state? So I think it's inevitable that the federal government will do something, simply so that you don't have this patchwork of state regulations where companies are then left having to do something different in every state.
Yes, I think that would be called for.
Yes.
To unify the laws. But tell me more about European GDPR law, privacy law, and what rights it gives to people.
So GDPR, first of all, applies to any data that's collected about a resident of the European Union. So for some U.S. companies, it's not applicable. If their business is entirely limited to the U.S. and they don't collect any data about a European resident, they wouldn't have to comply with it. But many companies have their business extends beyond the borders of the U.S. and they have operations in Europe, or some of their customers are in Europe. in which case they're collecting European data, or maybe they employ people in Europe. Like my company, Cogito, employs people in Ireland. So we collect data about our Irish employees and therefore are subject to GDPR. Now GDPR gives people rights in a few different areas. Number one is there's a category of rights that it gives to what they call data subjects. So there's a part of the law that gives the access rights for data subjects. And one of these is, for example, just you have the right to know what data they have about you. You have the right to request a list, and they have to tell you every bit of personal information that they're holding about you. Another right that you have is you have the right to request that that data be transferred. Either maybe you want it sent to your doctor, or maybe you want it sent to your lawyer, or maybe you want a copy personally. They have to comply with sending you a copy in industry standard formats of all the data that they're collecting about you. Another right that you have is you can say, hey, I want you to restrict the way you use my data. So one thing, for example, is you might say, it's okay to use my data to process transaction, but I don't want you using it to make an automated decision about you. There's a lot of artificial intelligence platforms, and you and I have talked about artificial intelligence in a past episode. But AI sometimes leads to information being used to make decisions on an automated basis. Like based on your credit score and your credit history, you're either going to be approved for a loan or rejected on a purely automated basis using an algorithm. So you have the right as a consumer in the EU to say, I don't want my data to be used to make any automated decisions about me. You have to make those decisions. A human basically has to make those decisions, and using judgment. You can also ask for your data to be terminated, and say, don't use my data for anything. And there is an exception to that we can talk about. But and then finally, you have the right to complain. So in the EU, they've set up a series of data protection authorities, DPAs, that exist in each of the countries. And you have rights under the DPAs. You can request a hearing, you can request redress, there's damages that can be assessed for violations. So there's a whole series of those data subject access rights. And then another set of protections is, viewers may be aware of cookies. When you visit a website, you've probably seen over the last year that a banner comes up and says, here's our policy with respect to cookies. Cookies are information that the websites collect about you and your browsing so that they can service you or remember you next time you come back. And the GDPR places restrictions now on how companies can use cookies on their websites. And they have to tell you, they have to disclose what cookies they collect, how they're used, and they have to give you certain opt-out rights where you can say, I don't want cookies collected for this, or I don't want my cookies used for this purpose. So when you see those pop-ups come now on new sites that you haven't visited before, and you have to click a button to acknowledge their cookie policy, that's what that is. And that was really generated in part largely by GDPR and then also the California law that I mentioned earlier, so the CCPA. Those are the genesis of a lot of that disclosure about cookies.
Shawn, it seems like GDPR is very thorough and encompassing, but how is that different from, or how are American laws in California, like you mentioned,
Yes.
Virginia and Colorado, in comparison to GDPR?
I think people really feel like GDPR still sets the standard. And, like I know for my company, once you're fully compliant with GDPR and you've really done everything that GDPR requires, there's not a lot of extra work to do to comply with some of these state statutes, but there is some. So for example, in California, if you market to California households, you have to have certain rights right on the website, your retail website, that consumers access. For example, to elect to opt out of automated marketing. So you can click on a button that basically says, do not market to me, using the data you collect on this website. There's also a button, a way you can basically tell companies that they're not allowed to sell your data to any third party. So you can use it internally to service me, but you're not allowed to sell it to anyone externally. So California especially was really focused on websites, businesses that market to consumers, through digital means, and are collecting data on through those digital channels about you, and then using it to market to you.
Under any of these laws, can a person just completely save their data and prohibit a company from using their data?
So under GDPR, you are allowed to say, stop using my data, and some of the states kind of have similar rights. But there is one thing to note. There is this concept of legitimate use, and there is an exception that basically says that in order to provide the service that the customer is requesting, if there's certain information that you absolutely have to have, well, then you can use that data even if there's an opt-out request. So for example, if you were on Amazon and you wanted to buy a product and have it shipped to you, you couldn't ask them to delete your shipping address or your name or your address, because how else are they going to deliver the package to you? So there are a number of legitimate uses where the company can say, we'll observe your request with respect to anything else that we're doing, like making automated decisions, but we have to, as long as you still want us to provide this service to you, of course they can stop being a customer, but as long as you want to buy this product or use our service, we still need this basic amount of data to be able to fulfill your request. And so you can't stop that, assuming you still want the product or service.
Today we are here with attorney Shawn Hoyt, who is running operations for this amazing big company, Cogito. And we're talking about data privacy. Shawn, we have 5 minutes before we end this, but what can a company do if they are afraid of liability, worried about data privacy liability?
Yeah.
What can a company do?
So this is something that in my role I think a lot about. One of my roles as an attorney at Cogito is to make sure we're complying with laws, but also protecting the company from liability. Data privacy, especially in California, where there's a private right of action, an attorney can bring a lawsuit on behalf of a California resident. So there's real risk and exposure. In Europe, the data protection authorities can bring actions and have sought millions of dollars or euros in fines. So companies have to be careful. First of all, what you have to do as a company depends on your role. So there's this concept of, are you the data controller or are you the data processor? And I'll explain what that means. If you're the company that's interfacing directly with the client, so you're Amazon or you're Spotify, or you're the business that's, the customer went to your website, they're buying your product or service, you're the one asking them for the information, and you're the one directly collecting it. You're the data controller. So you have, if they want to make a data subject access request, they make it to you. If they want to get their information back or stop processing, they would do it directly with you. You have that primary frontline liability. Cogito, by contrast, is a company that services those kind of companies. So we wouldn't have a contract directly with Amazon's customer. We might have a contract with Amazon to help their customer service. And so we're what's called a data processor. So we get the data from Amazon, and then we process it for them. But we still have obligations to Amazon to make sure that they can perform their obligations. And so you need to have processes in place as a company, either as the controller or processor, to say, I know exactly what information I collect. I know exactly where to find it. So if somebody asks for it, I know where it is. I have the ability to isolate it, return it, delete it, all of those capabilities. I have information security protections in place, like encryption, firewalls, the kind of things that prevent bad people from hacking into your network and stealing information. And then I have the ability to return the data if requested or respond to an audit request, things like that. And finally, that I have what's called a data protection officer, a DPO. I have someone with expertise in my organization who's responsible for compliance. And so companies have had to make sure either internally or externally they have an expert in place who's watching over all of this and kind of making sure that everything's okay.
Very important information and crucial. We only have 2 minutes left, but just quickly maybe say if for an individual person, how can they protect their privacy? And we only have a few minutes.
Absolutely. So first thing to do is, if you're concerned about your privacy, is whatever websites or services that you're using, read their privacy policy. It's on their website. It's usually at the bottom is a link, and you can see exactly what they're collecting and what they do with it and what rights you have. It'll all be disclosed in the privacy policy. You can also, on whatever apps you're using, especially like on your computer or your phone, check the privacy settings. There's ways on Facebook or Spotify, Google, any of these apps to restrict the privacy settings in terms of what they collect and what they can do with it. So that's another way. You can also sign up for services that help you monitor how your data is being used, and they help to look out for like identity theft. For example, they would know if someone was requesting a loan in your name based on data that they stole. And then finally, you have the rights that I mentioned earlier to ask companies, tell me, what data do you have?
Very interesting, Shawn. This is a fascinating topic, and I think it's a very much more of a longer conversation than we had today. But that's all the time we have. And I just want to thank you for being here. Attorney Shawn Hoyt is a corporate counsel and runs the operations for Cogito Corporation. And with this episode, we learned about data privacy and data privacy laws in the United States and around the world. And this episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. And it will also be posted at Boston Neighborhood Network, Vimeo account, and blog. Thank you for your time, and I hope you join us again next month. My name is Lucy Rivera, and I'm your host today. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again.